Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Brian Thatcher, and welcome to Mercy Unbound, a series that aims to provide hope, an avenue for healing, and one that will help you understand and then better live the great mercy of God. With me today is Mark Antonacci. He's an attorney. He's published numerous articles and written two of the most substantive and comprehensive books ever written on the Shroud of Turin. I've got one in front of me. I've read it. It's an incredible read. Test the Shroud at the atomic and molecular levels. We're going to be talking about that. I'm going to be asking him some questions. Mark's given numerous interviews and presentations. He's been studying the Shroud for over 40 years and is considered one of the world's leading experts. He is currently working on a third book called The Shroud of Turin 101. This book is available on Amazon or through a distributor, Baker and Taylor, or is that Barker and Taylor? Baker and Taylor?
I think it's Baker and Taylor.
Baker and Taylor. Okay, but it's really a wonderful read and a very in-depth study. But welcome, Mark. And first off, you've been doing this for many years. How did you first get interested in the Shroud?
I was an agnostic, and it's actually a good background to have if you're going to be interested in the Shroud. As an agnostic, I stumbled onto the subject as a result of an argument with an old girlfriend, and everybody asked me that question, so I made it the preface of my 2000 book, which was called The Resurrection of the Shroud, and that's in its third printing, but it's only available now electronically. The first two printings have run out, but it's the only humor in the book. I just, if it wasn't for that argument with her, I wouldn't have stumbled onto to the subject of the Shroud of Turin. The Sturp scientists, a couple of them, one of them got together with a guy named Gary Habermas, who's a well-known apologetics professor, and they wrote a book on the Shroud, and it contained all of these scientific articles that were just coming out in the early 80s in the peer-reviewed scientific journals. And if it wasn't for the argument, I would have never paid any attention to the article. And even if I had read the article, I probably wouldn't have went and read the book. But the argument was, in essence, about the fact that I was an agnostic and she wasn't. And that was the atmosphere that hooked me.
Okay. Now, in your book, you develop the point that a miraculous radiation event occurred to this dead and crucified man who was wrapped in the customary burial cloth of the time after a multitude and series of wounds. You very nicely describe and explain that the body images are three-dimensional on the Shroud, and they're embedded in a cloth. Of course, it's only two-dimensional, and that these features were encoded in direct proportion to their distance from the cloth. Can you kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah. If an artist wants to indicate depth or height in a picture, he has to resort to shadows to make like something look like a valley, so that maybe the mountain or hill next to it stands out a little higher in elevation. It's really not, because the canvas is a two-dimensional surface. If you took a normal picture and put it in, there happens to be a computer imaging technology that will display true distance information from a picture. The trouble is, all the pictures are on two-dimensional surfaces, and whenever they're used in a device like that, they're always distorted. But this instrument just happened to be around, And John Jackson and a couple other scientists decided, let's see what happens with the image when you put it in there, because way back in the early part of the 20th century, Paul Vignon was one of the first scientists to start studying these images from the shroud. And he noticed that if a man was buried in a cloth and the top part of the cloth draped over the underlying body, he noticed that the parts of the cloth that were touching or closest to the body were a little darker than the parts of the cloth that were away from the body, like around the bridge of the nose or the eye sockets, things like that. And so when they put it in there, it displayed a perfect three-dimensional image of the face. And the face has, you got your nose, your cheeks, your chin, your forehead, your eyebrows. It's all a different height. If somebody's laying on his back and you looked at it, your nose would be higher, your chin would be next, your forehead, but it's all different types of relief. And it's all within a short distance on your head. So it really stood out on the facial image. But they were stunned, and they came to realize that if one area is darker than another one on the cloth, the way it's darker is because there's a greater number of colored fibers of the threads in that area than not. And it's so subtle. That's just one more reason why a forger could never have done this. It's hard to explain, but the depth, the intensity of the color is in perfect correlation with the distance that the cloth was from the underlying body, if that helps you any.
Now, explain the feature of the image's superficiality. Is that what you're talking about? It's only on the outermost portion?
Oh, yes. And this is a typical thread has about 200 fibers in it. If your arm was a thread, the fibers would be the hairs on your arm. And it's just the topmost fibers, maybe the depth of one, possibly two fibers on a thread that's colored. No other, it doesn't penetrate beyond those fibers. And those fibers throughout the entire length and width of the two body images, they're pretty close. They're uniformly colored. There's no more than a 10% difference in the colors all up and down the length or width of the body. And a painter, the shroud was always thought to have been a painting in Europe. It was considered that since the 14th century. But a painter could never paint that delicately. And the coloring appears to be all the way around the fiber. And there's no coloring inside the fiber. An artist could never, the finest paintbrushes in medieval times was horsehair. But a horsehair is much thicker than the fiber on the thread of a linen cloth. He couldn't even singled out individual fibers and painted them, let alone paint them all the way around the same intensity. He just couldn't do it. And to be honest with you, you have to stand 10 or 15 feet away from the cloth itself to distinguish the body image from the non-body image. He would have needed a focal microscope to color the particular fibers that he has to stand 10 or 15 feet away to see. And it would have just been impossible for many other reasons. And on top of which is these fibers, these colored fibers, don't consist of any materials of any kind, let alone paint or powder or any kind of material you want to propose. They're very, very delicately encoded.
Now, Luigi Gonella, he'd studied the shroud for many years, and he said that an agent acting at a distance with decreasing intensity is almost by definition a radiation event.
Yes.
And I was always fascinated, I think it was back in the 20s when they photographed the shroud, they realized that it's actually a negative image. Can radiation do all this?
In my book, I think around, it's in chapter 5, and I think it's around pages 105 and 106. I list about 30 to 35 unique or remarkable features on that body image. And only one agent, and that's low energy radiation, can account for all of those features. And to encode all of the features that you're talking about, like it's a photographic negative, it's three-dimensional, the density decreases as you move away from it. Only radiation could do those things. And to get the high resolution on it, the source has to be the body for a number of reasons in order to get the image of a human body. And all the physicians and the pathologists that study it all agree that this is a human body. It has human blood on it, human serum. There's another quote by a guy named John Heller. He too was a physician and a scientist, a chemist. And one of the features of the body image is that it's not only encoded through the space between the cloth and the body, but it's encoded in a vertically directional manner, 180 degrees up or down. But that's how the image was encoded. And he makes a quote similar to Dr. Gonella. He says, it's as if every pore and every hair of the body contained a micro miniature laser. That's how stunning this image is. And you just can't think of another agent other than radiation from that body that could encode all the information. To give you an example, the three-dimensionality, we know it's three-dimensional image because all the signs and the distribution of the fibers is on the cloth. If the correlation of this distribution is directly related to the body, in other words, the distance it is from the body, that's just one of many signs that the source of the radiation could only be the body, because it's directly correlated between the body and the cloth, and all the information is on the cloth. So it had to come from the body. And the same thing with the vertical directionality of it. It's encoded in a vertical direction through the spaces between the cloth and the body. The directionality of the radiation could only come from the body.
Now, you mentioned about the blood and serum on the shroud. Amazingly, the blood marks still have a reddish discoloration after all these years. How's that explained?
Low energy radiation could also explain that. There's some initial work been done with ultraviolet lighting, and there's also some work done by a doctor, oh gosh, I'll think of his name, but right now I can't think of it, who worked with neutrons and ultraviolet light. And he said the combination of neutrons and UV light could most closely match that of the shroud. And that's one area that future research needs to be done. But blood, normally, if you cut yourself shaving, it immediately comes out that bright red color. But as soon as it hits the air, it starts oxidizing and dehydrating, and it starts turning, you know, that purple scab color. And in a few days, certainly a few weeks or months, and God knows 700 years, right, it'll turn brown and black. And I've walked through the British, not the British, the Egyptian Museum in Turin. And there's just an endless number of mummy cloths there. And where there's blood on those mummy cloths, it is just dark brown or black as you can get. Blood just doesn't stay red. Regardless if the shroud is 700 years old or 2,000 years old, it shouldn't have red blood on it. Right. And the funny thing about it is it's not only maintain that red color, but if you shine sunlight on it, or even indirect sunlight, the blood marks look even redder when it does it. And Goldoni's his name, Dr. Carlo Goldoni, and he hypothesizes or wonders whether the neutrons may have done something at the molecular level that allows it to become redder and not only maintain that redness, but get a little redder every time it gets a little sunlight. It's an area that needs a lot more study and experimentation.
Now, I want to just get maybe back to the basics a little bit. How do we know that this person was crucified? What are some of the things on the shroud that, and does it, you know, correlate remarkably well with what the scripture tells us?
Oh, yes, yes. There's a, I'll just have to summarize it. He has nail wounds in his wrist and his feet. When a crucifixion victim hung from the cross, he can't breathe. He can't exhale. He can take air in, but to exhale, he has to push on his nailed feet and pull himself up with his nailed wrist just to raise his chest up enough to exhale, take another gulp of air in, and then he collapses down. But to survive a crucifixion for anything longer than even a few minutes, you have to do this pushing and pulling motion. There's blood marks on his forearms that run down, and they're in two different positions, roughly about 10 degrees apart, where it flows on one angle, but when he raises his shoulders, it moves his arms out roughly about 10 degrees or so. And you see that on there. He has an abnormally expanded rib cage, and his pectoral muscles are enlarged from pulling and pushing himself up, and they're drawn in toward the shoulders and the arms. He has this is especially noticeable on the back, on the dorsal image. It's also, you can see it on frontal image, his left leg is higher than the right leg. It was most likely, this is because it was moved over to the right leg where one nail went through both legs. But his leg is still up in that position because rigor mortis sets in on this particular man while he's in the vertical crucifixion position. And if rigor mortis had declined, the leg would have, you know, fallen by gravity, but it's still up higher when they take the nails out. The same thing with the chest muscles and that. If you look at the back of on the dorsal image, his thighs, his buttocks, and his back muscles are stiff and rigid from somebody who's been going through just these types of exercises that you'd have to do when you were crucified. Identifying features of which particular individual there's just as many. He has a full crown that was placed over the entire head, which is consistent with how people wore crowns in Eastern times, in ancient times. Invariably, Jesus is depicted with the wreathlets or a single row of crowns over the full head. This man's wounds go from the sides all the way over to the other side and the back. It's a full type of crown. This man, especially apparent on the positive images of the man, he's been beaten about the head and the face, and he's got about 10 blood marks from sharp pointed objects from a crown over his head and the back of his head. And Jesus is not only beaten after his trial, but he's also beaten by the Roman executioners when they put the crown over him, and then they're hitting him over the head as well. You can see the consistency of Roman executioners, because he has about 100 scourge marks all over his body. While most of them are on the dorsal side, a good number of them still, the whip wrapped around his back and cover his chest and legs as well. They're all over his body. They're quite consistent with the Roman flagrum. And it's not only consistent from a distance when you look at the full-length images, but when you look up tight, up close at these scourge marks under a microscope and photographic enlargers, the skin reacts exactly like the dumbbell-shaped barbells at the end of a Roman flagrum. And they've excavated Roman flagrums. There's many more. There's a postmortem side wound from which blood and water flows. This too is consistent with the Roman lancea that the foot soldiers would have used, and that's who comprised the Roman military guard. He has abrasions across his shoulders, consistent with carrying a heavy, rough object, and there's scratches and cuts on his knees and his shins, and he's even got dirt on his nose. These are all consistent with a man who's fallen from carrying a heavy, rough object, but he can't break his fall. There's a lot of things that are consistent with a crucifixion and who this particular individual was, and that's to not even mention the consistency of the burial customs that people who sat on the council would know about, like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea.
Mark, tell us a little bit about mentioned in the book about the Roman coin over the right eye, and then the pollens and grains and things that were found on the shroud that were endemic to Jerusalem. Can you share those thoughts with us?
Yeah, there's about at least, I think, at minimum, 90 some pollens from a thorn plant that grows only in Jerusalem and the surrounding area. There's other pollen that are indicative of that area as well, but they're not as many, and they're not, they're kind of hard to see. They're on sticky tape, and the sticky tape over time blurs the vision of the viewer. It's one blur when you look in there now. I think they have to get more samples, and they should vacuum them and then look at them individually. They were removed by a Swiss criminologist, Max Fry. with Scotch tape, and it sucked them up, and they're mounted on this sticky tape. And you want something that all people can look at, all experts can look at and get a clear vision of, so that everyone can agree what type of, if possible, what type of pollen it is. The 91 that I mentioned, Fry identified even more than 91. I'm being conservative. Another Israeli botanist identified at least 91 of those. The pollens are tangible, and that's pretty good evidence. And what is less objective or less tangible is the identification of images of some of the plants or flowers from which these pollens came, and also the letters and a staff, like a king on a coin that would have been a Pontius Pilate lepton. These are not as tangible as you'd wish. And so you're trying to discern whether there are such images like this on the positive images. And you're trying to get some type of corroboration from the cloth itself. And perhaps we can deal with that better in the future. But right now, some think there are, and as many or more think that is still an open-ended question.
Now, I've read that some feel that the body couldn't be that of Jesus because the Jews always washed the body before burial. Is that an accurate statement for somebody who's been crucified?
To be honest with you, this is one of the signs of that the people that buried him had a good knowledge of the Jewish burial customs. While it was common to wash a body among Jews before he was buried, if he bled before he died and after he died, if that kind of blood is on his body, and it's just a small amount, maybe about the size of an egg or an egg and a quarter, I think. It's a small amount, but if there's pre-mortem and post-mortem blood on their body, you're not supposed to wash him. You leave the blood lie and you bury him as he is. And the man on the shroud clearly has the largest blood stain of all is a post-mortem side wound from which blood and water not only flows all the way down the chest, but it even wraps around and goes across the lower portion of the man's back. He would not have been washed according to Jewish burial customs. So no, he wouldn't have. And all the blood marks on the shroud flow in a vertical position, consistent with the types of wounds he said. When he was scourged, he would have been hitched to a post or something with his arms here or up there. But the only place there's not scourge marks is on the arms. The rest of the body is covered with the scourge marks. If you would have washed him, they would have all had to re-bleed again. And how are you going to stand a man up inside these small tombs and get all his blood to flow again like they did on the cross? And I doubt that very, very much, that it was washed. He wasn't supposed to be washed under those circumstances.
Right. Yeah. Now, Mark, we're going to have another show in follow-up, but in a few minutes, let's talk a little bit about your theory regarding neutron and proton particle radiation. Kind of what is it, and do you believe that when this miraculous event happened, that's kind of what caused the imprint left on the shroud? So just kind of introduce us to what is neutron and proton particle radiation.
Okay. Neutrons and protons are the basic building blocks of all matter. All matter consists of atoms, and I think it's 99.7% of the weight or mass of all atoms is in its nucleus, which is comprised solely of neutrons and protons. And they are held together inside the nucleus by the strong nuclear force. It's the strongest force known to science. Something happened to this body in my hypothesis, because all the naturalistic and artistic methods ever devised failed to encode all of the features on the body images and the at least 150 different kinds of blood marks of all different kinds of sizes, of which we've barely touched on. But they failed to encode both of these numerous features. And the evidence does indicate that some type of radiation came from that body. And protons have been tested. A biophysicist named Jean-Baptiste Rinaldo, he was also a French priest. He was the first to come out with the hypothesis that protons and neutrons emanated from the body. And the experiments with on linen, a lot of these superficial features are really have a good job with by Rinaldo's radiation. Subsequent experiments have shown that you can lower that the amount of radiation, the intensity, even farther than his original low amount of radiation, and encode it even better. I picked protons for that form the image because it seems to work best. Neutrons, since they're held together and they comprise, neutrons and protons comprise the nucleus, if the protons escape, the neutrons would also escape because they're all bound with the protons. The interesting thing about neutrons, while it does not cause the body image, it might contribute to the redness of the blood marks. But the one other really critical thing that neutrons do is, and this has been known for decades throughout the world, but neutrons, of a stream of neutrons, will create radioactive atoms in whatever object it hits or radiates. And one of those radioactive atoms is carbon-14. They discovered that carbon-14 is created in the atmosphere after, in the 1930s, when neutrons are discovered, scientists started taking a stream of neutrons and irradiating things. And they discovered it will create carbon-14 and other radioactive atoms. But carbon-14 and two other ones, I won't get overly complicated here, are long lasting, and they stay in an object for hundreds of thousands of years. And one of these long lasting radioactive atoms, the third long lasting of the three, is carbon-14. And all the scientists, even the ones that are made, will agree, if you get a sufficient number of these neutrons in a string, it would create carbon-14. And if an object is irradiated with neutrons, there's a 0% chance that the carbon-14 date, which simply measures the carbon-14 atoms and compares them to the carbon-12 atoms, that's how they base the age of an object. But if you're going to create more than there naturally was, the ratios will indicate that it's much younger. That the measuring instrument, called an accelerator mass spectrometer, cannot distinguish between the ones that are created in nature and the ones that are created by a stream of neutrons in this case from a body.
So that would explain the errors found in the carbon-14 dating, because there's too many of them in making it younger, and that's an important point, I think, in all this, that the dating done 40 years ago was perhaps, well, was fallacious because of things they didn't even know about back then. Which brings to my next question, Mark. How big is this instrument, this mass spectrometer? There are probably not a lot of them around, I wouldn't think. And why couldn't you test the tomb if these things are hanging around thousands of years, or areas where you thought Jesus was buried? Because wouldn't there be radioactive materials there as well?
You're right. You could. You could get, if Jesus's, if there's any part of the rock shelf from Jesus's tomb, there would be 2 of these 3 radioactive atoms in limestone. And you could tell whether it was irradiated and how much radiation it received. You would know where the neutron radiating event occurred. And you could, I won't get too complicated from this, but you could determine when that radiating event occurred to this chunk of limestone. Mm. And you could also determine that and more from testing the shroud. And I'll be happy to talk about this in the future. But if you took cloth or blood or watery fluid or charred material, which is on the shroud, or sewing threads from the side seam, if those were on the shroud at the time of this hypothetical neutron radiating event, all of them would contain these various radioactive atoms. And you could prove not only they were radiated, how much they were radiated, but you could prove, and when this neutron radiating event occurred, but you could prove the real age of these materials. And most of all, you could prove that the source of the neutron radiation was the body, because the body, like the denser parts of the body, the chest and the abdomen, would give off more than, say, the fingers or the arm. But they actually have, they call them Monte Carlo neutron particle. It's a code that they have. And these things can follow the paths of neutrons inside a structure and tell you a pretty good idea about where they'll land all over the cloth. It would be real easy to tell that whether the source was the body or not. And all the other factors on the shroud indicate the source from the body too. The body image and the blood marks obviously indicate they came from a body. And it's human blood and that type of thing. But you could prove some amazing things if you tested the shroud further.
Wow. Well, we definitely want to have you back to get more into this neutron and proton particle radiation, because while you're speaking, I'm thinking of more questions, coming in my head. So for those watching this show, just know that there'll be a follow-up because I'm thinking of some questions that I'd love to get answered. And Mark, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Mercy Unbound. We'll have you back. All the audience, please enjoy these shows. You can watch the podcast at anchor.fm/Dr. Brian Thatcher, Mercy Unbound at drbrianthatcher.com, and support us if you can. And God bless all of you. And Mark, we'll look forward to having you back. So thank you so much.
Glad to be here.
Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for the video portion. The podcast can be heard at anchor.fm/drbrian, Bryan Thatcher, Thatcher, and on all the major podcast forums. I would love to speak at your church or conference, and please consider supporting our efforts to spread the truth to a hurting world. Thank you again. And for more information, go to the website at drbrianthatcher.com.